We begin by measuring internet engagement. And why is that? Well, primarily because all of your other alternatives are not very good, really. Typically organizations use things like number of page hits or percentage of employees visiting or things like this, primarily because they can get their hands on them rather than they're actually particularly useful or they inform in any meaningful way. And there are companies who will try and benchmark, or who will suggest that they will benchmark your internet, but in general that just means a kind of very subjective review. So we think there's three problems with the existing methods. The first one is, by definition, if you're looking at analytics, they only look at a specific aspect of engagement. So yes, percentage of employees using the internet, for example. Or you might use a user survey, something about perceptions. By the way, I should emphasize, all of these presentations will be available on SlideShare afterwards, and hopefully in the next week or so we should get the videos up. So you can kind of don't have to worry too much about trying to capture everything now. But so the issue is that each of those really only shines a light on a part of the success of your internet. And so to get around that, people kind of do lots of different things, a user survey here, some analytics there, and then they kind of mash them together to form some sort of overview. And by definition, that is very subjective. And that brings us to the last problem, which means that you can't really compare your performance with anyone else's performance. So we were also frustrated by this because it was, one of the questions we get asked is, and I think even said it, today, it was, well, how good is our internet, or how well are we doing? So we approached the problem from a completely different angle. We decided to say, okay, what is a successful internet? How would a fully engaged internet look like? Okay, so a fully engaged internet we defined as 100% of the users, so everybody visiting the site every day, consuming content, and clicking every possible button, more or less, doing everything that they could do on the internet every visit they go to. Okay, obviously not feasible, nor is it even desirable, but it's a definition of 100% engagement, and once you have that definition, that allows us to compare very different intranets. Because, an internet, 100% for one group might be 500 people, for another group might be 250,000. Or for a simple, every possible form of interaction, well, it comes, news-led, it might be about consuming the content, while for a digital workplace, it could mean something else entirely. But it's really about measuring, measuring the engagement against the potential, or measuring the performance against the potential of that intranet. And that allows us then to compare different intranets. And so with this definition, and then by gathering data from different organizations, lots of different organizations, in fact, not just our own clients, we've been able to create a benchmark that you can now measure your intranet against this kind of common benchmark. And I'll come back to that later on. So how do we actually measure the engagement? Well, this is how we do it. So I've about 10 minutes to explain that. I'm just going to explain it in the way it was explained to me, okay, because I don't really know what it means either. So we start off by, we split our engagement definition that you saw earlier on, everybody doing everything every day, into these kind of two things. The first is kind of interest, which is all around the visitors and how often they come and so on. And the second is around activity, what they do when they get there. And it's the combination of this that will give us our engagement. So the way we visualize interest, or the way we visualize the kind of mathematical definition of interest, again, taking those 3 points around visitor quantity, visitor frequency, and visitor depth, we use those to create this kind of cube, this container that is bound by the maximum, so everybody visiting every day and consuming content. And this is our kind of interest container. And so if everybody visited every day and consumed the 10 pages, they'd fill up that cube. But of course, people don't. You can hardly see it, I think, here. But here's there should be the outline of the original cube here. And if we said that half the people visited half the time, consumed half the content, you'd end up with an interest figure of 12.5%. So that's the kind of interest side. And then we've got the activity side, performing each possible form of interaction once per visit. And if we said that every time somebody did something that they could do on the intranet, whether it was like a search, a download, a comment, request leave, book a meeting room, whatever else you can do on your intranet, that you connected these gold bars and you filled up your interest container with these gold bars. And if everybody did everything, your container would be full. So if they did perform each possible form of interaction once per visit, you'd have 100% kind of interaction or activity. And if they did half the number of interactions, you'd have 50% of the activity. Again, unfortunately, it doesn't come up very well on the screen here. The gray is gone, but we still have our original box out here of what the maximum amount of engagement could be, and we've now got that smaller box, which was the most it could be, because that's how many people were visiting the site, and that's the kind of maximum interest. And then we've half filled that box with activity of 50%, and we combine those two to give us an engagement figure of 6.25%. So half the people, can you see it here? Yes, you can see it here. So we've got an engagement figure of 6.25%, which represents half the people visiting half the time, consuming half the possible content, and doing half the possible interactions, and that gives us that 6.25 figure. Which, by the way, if you've ever had your engagement analyzed, we had a lot of problems at first when we were doing this, and we were giving feedback to people that said, yeah, you scored 0.007, that's really good. And people found that hard to believe. So we have played around with the numbers and just kind of cubed them just to make the numbers a bit bigger and look a little less disappointing. But it's not the actual number that matters, really. As you'll see in a minute, what matters is how your number compares to everyone else's number, and ultimately whether that number is going up or down, and kind of what's influencing that number. Okay, so we've kind of seen this already. So that's our complete engagement model. We're taking all this kind of raw data at the bottom, which is like visitor frequency, how many visitors, how many downloads, searches, comments, form submissions, shares, and so on. We kind of combine those to create this engagement number. And apparently, that explains the maths. So you can see immediately, actually, that besides getting this engagement number, there's a lot more you can do with it, because you can see how this engagement number actually kind of is constructed. And you can use it for two main insights, really, broadly into two main insights. So external benchmarking and internal diagnosis. So let's look at external benchmarking. If at any stage you're tempted to go to www.smallworlders.com/submit-your-data, you'll be presented with a form like this, which asks for that raw data, okay? And if you enter all the data in that form, like all of these companies did, and more actually, we'll give you one of these, okay? And this is a kind of an engagement snapshot. And this snapshot, there's two parts to it. The first part is this engagement score. So we will tell you what your engagement number is, but importantly, we will tell you how that compares to everybody else's. Okay, so is your engagement figure, in the lowest quartile, in the upper quartile, or whatever, and we'll tell you how that kind of came about. What's the balance of interest and activity that gave you that number. Now, there is an argument to say, well, how can you really compare, this intranet of 100 people, that is a news site, to my global digital workplace of hundreds of thousands of people? And there is some argument to that. I mean, bearing in mind you are measuring yourself a benchmark that takes across both the small and the large and all different types of companies. But what we can do, the other thing we collect on the data is like a kind of a definition or a fingerprint of that intranet. So, how many pages there are. Is it a kind of collaborative site or transactional site, and the number and types of interactions available. So we can compare you to a general benchmark, or we can kind of drill it down and compare you to other similar intranets. And we also actually collect data around as well, the platforms that people use and the industry sector and so on. So potentially we can, really zone in on that. Now, this is obviously a snapshot, but engagement moves all the time in reaction to events and so on. And that brings us to the second part of the insights, really, that you get from engagement, and that's internal diagnosis. So what I'm going to share with you is how to put this. The way people talk about problems and our opportunities. Well, this was something that basically, perhaps we failed and rescued, okay, in an intranet that we built. So we were given a brief. Probably looks familiar. We want improved collaboration, people sharing ideas and networking. We want everyone to have access to information, and we want to provide inspiration. And this was for a luxury goods distributor in the Middle East. Okay, so across 14 markets in the Middle East. This is a few years ago now. And so we built them this, which I think even still looks pretty nice, really, pretty cool and funky. Very much the social intranet, very much the zeitgeist, certainly of the time, dominated really by a central activity feed, Facebook-like, kind of Yammer-like, activity feed in the middle. And if you look, actually, you'll see it's hugely used as well. Well, you can't read it here, but it's like, 34 minutes ago, an hour ago, lots of commenting, liking, and sharing, very active. And then there's some user-generated content and some editorialized content across the top. Looks probably like a lot of contemporary intranets, really. And if you look at it, again, I said it was social intranet, and you'll see that, it's mainly dominated by social features, surrounded by then some content and some transactions that you got at through the navigation. And it all looked like it was hugely successful, and on the surface it looked like it was hugely successful. When you kind of drilled in and look at the engagement, what we had was this huge peak at launch and then a drop-off. Now, to be honest, you can expect this with any intranet launch, by the way. And we had said to the client this before, and so the client came back around here and said, yeah, there's been a huge peak, huge drop-off, but we're not worried because he told us this was going to happen. And typically, what you'd expect is, as long as they're doing kind of their job, you'd expect this to start climbing back up again. Now, they were doing their job. They did a great job. They had for the number of people that they had in their organization, they had a small team who were creating great content, running kind of activation initiatives, everything they should be doing. But it was stubbornly refusing to move, really, from the bottom. And when we drilled down, and obviously it was a little more in depth than this, so very simply, we could see all that activity was happening, but actually, other than a huge kind of peak at launch, interest entirely dropped off. So in other words, there was a small group of people who were totally engaged, but the vast majority of people came and left and never came back again. Now, there may have been reasons for this. Dan will talk after this about the adoption chasm, and that could be a possible explanation, may have had an influence. Also, this is the Middle East. You're trying to get 14 markets in the Middle East to kind of talk to each other. That could be an issue. Culturally, could be an issue. But when we did some research, this was certainly an issue. So everybody, when they saw it, they said, well, this is a social, which it was, but it's social and nothing else. So they didn't see anything else there. So this was certainly a problem. When we went back, we addressed it by taking this original design and just tweaking it so that we brought the content to the surface and kind of reduced the emphasis on social features. So you'll see there's still social on every, you click on a thing, you can like it and comment and share and so on. But in terms of the activity feed, it's now kind of down here. And the engagement score on the relaunch, well, you can see, really, much closer to what you might expect. Again, a bit of a peak. Okay, it drops off, but you can see it's beginning to build. And although we had reduced the kind of emphasis on the enterprise social networking, if you like, the activity actually picked up because basically there was more people on the site, more people using it. So all those people who were using it continued to use it, and a whole bunch more. And that was really reflected by the greater number of people using it. You'll also see there's another peak there in August 2013. So the other thing we can do using this, some of the other reports that we can run off the engagement analysis are these kind of heat maps. And actually, if we look around, what was it I said? What date was it again? August 2013. I think we went back and we found you could see a kind of a cluster of activity, which is all around form filling, I think. And we can see that. And in fact, we can see clusters of activity, which may not have been obvious before, of different types of activity. And you can begin to analyze this, say, well, what caused that spike? And is it a positive spike? And is it something we should repeat to try and bring the engagement score up? Interesting enough, this one here is all around searching. And this one down here is all around kind of downloads. And what you saw is before the relaunch, which was here, there was a great deal of searching. Yellow is active, is kind of, lots of activity. Blue is less activity, and red is somewhere in the middle. So there was a lot of activity around searching, and then that completely drops off after the relaunch. But what you'll see is a lot more kind of download. So our kind of proposition around this is that because it was very much a social site dominated by that activity feed, people were desperately searching for information and perhaps couldn't find it, while with the relaunch, they were now getting access to that content and downloading it and using it and so on. So that gives you a flavor of what you can do with the engagement score. So you can get an indication of how you're performing relative to everybody else, and understand of what's influencing that performance and what exactly you're doing right and where you need to improve. And of course, engagement is the only metric really that addresses those three problems I mentioned earlier on about just intranet analytics in general, the completeness, the overview, and the comparison problems. So certainly that's enough. With a little ambition, you could, if you wanted to, take it a bit further. Because the engagement score is a single number, and in our experience, by the way, it's the kind of more senior people are, the more they seem to appreciate that this is a single number, something very simple, and they can kind of see whether it's going up or down. But if you want to be really ambitious, you could look for any correlations between that single number and single numbers and other numbers that the C-suite are kind of interested in. If you wanted to gain their attention, I mean, an obvious one would be employee engagement. You'd expect that an intranet as the kind of primary employee communications tool, or as a digital workplace, the primary employee enabling tool, would influence the employee engagement number. So you could look for correlations there. I don't know if you're familiar with the employee net promoter score from Bain & Co. consulting company. It's a kind of somehow they managed to patent a number range from 0 to 10, but anyway, it measured. One of the things they did do was show that there was a correlation between this employee net promoter score, which is a kind of a employee engagement number, and growth and profitability. So, if you really wanted to get ambitious, you could say, well, there's a relationship between employee engagement or internet engagement and employee engagement, and we know there's something between employee engagement and growth and profitability. Well, hey, imagine if you could show a correlation between internet engagement and profit and growth or something. Trying to stop the flood of money coming into your department would be really difficult. That would really get the attention of the C-suite. But anyway, I digress. You came here today looking for strategies for Intranet Success, and so far I've only given you obviously a metric, a way to measure that success. But really, that's going to be a vital part of this. Without a way of measure success, without a good way to measure your success, you won't know whether what you're doing is working or not.